Welcome to Free the Mind, Free the People, a podcast where we come together to empower each other through knowledge and discuss the issues that shape our everyday lives. All opinions and information shared in this podcast are held by the hosts alone and do not represent the stances of the University of Central Florida and the Department of Sociology.
Hi everyone, welcome back to Free the Mind, Free the People. I'm Marina, one of the hosts.
And I'm Halley, but with brown hair now. It's still me. I'm also one of the hosts.
We have a special guest scholar from our own UCF Sociology Department, Kristal Johnson. And we're very happy to have you here. So could you please give us some information about yourself, who you are, what is your expertise, and what got you into sociology?
Hello, thank you so much. I'm very glad to be here with you. I have quite a history with UCF, so I earned my undergraduate and graduate degree at UCF, as well as a graduate certificate. And I'm working on my PhD in sociology. I'm in my third year. So that is what brought me, because I have such a long history with UCF, at least in my opinion. I've been affiliated with UCF in a way for a long time. And so that is what brought me to the program. I've always had an interest in sociology and studying people, studying society and social change and things of that sort. My area is social inequality. I specifically focus on racial inequality. And so that is how I examine and analyze issues that are existing among us in society. And so, yeah, I am glad to be here with you all and look forward to our discussion.
Awesome. Well, thank you for that introduction. So today, before we get started, I wanted to reference back for any of you that might be listening and maybe didn't get a chance to follow through that mini-series. Episode 3, we split it into 3 parts, and we discussed first the Christian right and how that's affected Roe v. Wade and LGBTQ rights. Then we discussed the NRA and actually its racist roots. But also we discussed a little bit about gun control in a nuanced way. And then lastly, we discussed the Koch brothers and their influence with free speech debates, especially on campus with speakers like Matt Walsh. So if you haven't listen to that, please go back and listen to those and then join us back here for this conversation.
And for this conversation, we've talked about throughout our series about the anger and the frustration that we felt with all these social issues going on. And we call this series Redirect Your Outrage. And so now we want to give you guys, as our audiences, the outlets to transform our outrage. And so in this episode, we kind of outline as sociologists our philosophies of resistance to move forward when we're feeling this frustration but want to create change. So this is the point of this episode.
Yeah, so basically we're gonna go back a little bit to our very, very first episode, where we discussed kind of like the pressure that we felt as sociologists. So I know, Halley, you wanted to discuss that a little bit, just get us started.
Yeah. So if you remember in our first episode of this series, we talked about how kind of depressed we were feeling, how overwhelmed, how we didn't really know how to move forward with everything going on in politics and our social realm. And so we just needed to feel like all of this pressure was coming to us all at once and that we had to figure it all out. Not only as sociologists, but even those out there who are not in this field of study that are still feeling this pressure. You care about what's going on around you, you care about the people around you. And so we just wanted to talk about the pressure we were feeling and how to move forward from that.
Exactly. Yeah. So, and I think that part of that pressure was feeling basically like you have to, as an individual, especially us as people that are a bit kind of consumed by these topics, because that's what we do, that's what we study. We don't have a choice. But it feels like you have to take on all the issues at once. Like, as a person, you're aware of these things, and not just things in this country, but like globally. And so it feels like we all have to take all these issues, and if we don't, we failed somehow. So I just wanted to make the point, as we had this discussion, we do know that this is not possible. It is not possible for a single individual to take on all these issues, especially because I personally believe that at least lived experience is a huge thing for when you're addressing these issues. So not all of us have the same lived experience, and not all of us have the same interests or expertise. So that is something to take into consideration. We're not trying, as we discuss like how to deal with this, we're not trying to tell you, ooh, you as an individual, you have to take on all the issues. It's about a collective building of communities of resistance, as we call it, which we'll talk more about. But Kristal, tell us, how do you feel? Have you felt sort of the same thing? Yeah, what's your take on all of this?
You've been in sociology for a long time. I just want to know how you also deal with these overwhelming like interest in these topics.
Absolutely. I think one of the good things, or one of the best things, is what we're doing right now, and that's to talk about it, to have healthy conversation about these things. And sometimes, you have to take a moment to just be, right? To just breathe, and to just try and pull back and come away from it for a minute, because you have to take the time to take care of yourself. I mean, I know that's something that we will be talking about. So taking care of oneself is very important, and that plays a part in it. And I think we have to, as humans, and also dealing with the reality of situations. And so just like, Marina, you made a good point with lived experiences, because that is the reality, and no one can argue someone's reality, just like no one can argue history. What has happened is, in fact, what has happened. And so you can't cancel history, and you can't cancel lived experiences, because we know these things are real, and they are real in their experiences, in what people go through and deal with. And so understanding that it's bigger than us, like it's bigger than one thing and one movement. It's going to take much more than that. And people around the world are going through all different kinds of difficulties. And so, understanding that and recognizing that, and just like, there are moments to where society or people will resist certain negativity. People will resist certain forms of positivity. So
yes.
But I think like I said, like having conversations is a great way to work toward improving ourselves and talking more about it, and figuring out, okay, well, what next, type of thing.
Yeah, and
Absolutely.
I think in that same way, talking about history and how you can't cancel history, as we've discussed, had these discussions throughout the podcast, we know that throughout history we've seen those reactions constant, like push and pull, as Halley calls it, the pendulum that swings back and forth. And so we're living in a moment where we're right back there. Like we're living in a moment of reaction against social change, reaction against social progress as we see it. So that is one main point that we want to make in this discussion. We understand social progress is not linear because of that, because and then that frames how we respond to it. As you said, it's much bigger than just one movement. It's bigger than just like a specific group doing something at a specific moment. It has to be an ongoing, like all-encompassing, and we'll talk about coalitions and all those things, but it has to be a constant like building of that resistance for when that pendulum swings back. I can never say pendulum correctly. So I think speaking about progress not being linear, some of the things that we've learned, at least in our like critical race theory course, which you were in, Kristal, as well, we discussed like racial reactions and this sort of like collective reaction from white people mostly against social progress and social change throughout the civil rights movement. Like they're trying to bypass like integration efforts and things like that. And so we've seen Roe v. Wade, for example, is one thing that is fresh in our minds. It's an example of something that was decided through the Supreme Court at one point and now has been overturned. And we do know that the same thing is happening, or the same thing is being attempted by these same people and these same specific movements, among which is the Christian right, as we know, to overturn other decisions, federal decisions, under the guise of states' rights, in terms of like same-sex marriage, even interracial marriage. So this is something that we know is taking place right now. And another thing is with the idea what we call rearticulation. And that basically what it means is when the state basically absorbs or appropriates demands of movements, like social movements, to appease these movements. But really, as we've learned, everything's reversible in this system, especially. That could be a whole other podcast, just talking about what this system is and why this is happening. But we know it's happening. So, oh, and one more thing about rearticulation. An example of that that we learned about in that course was about how there was this like head of a university, I think he was president, I'm not sure, but he had said that having Black students in the classroom, he was fine with having them there because he thought that it was the perfect way to get them out of other things. By other things, it's basically like protesting and radical movements. So there's also, that's an example of rearticulation, taking this thing like integration and then making it for the advantage of those who want Black people and other marginalized people to be distracted or appeased. So
and that brings up a very good point with you know, things that have happened, speaking of history, the things that have happened in history to where, like for example, there were political movements and social movements in response to some of those things. And so I'll be more specific. So, you know, in terms of employing Black people into positions of quote unquote authority, or working in organizations or institutions that were not open at one point. And so opening those doors so that those people, those social members, those social groups can be distracted in a way to not involve themselves in things like Black Panther or anything like that. Like that's what was happening at that time. And the Black Panther movement was large at that time. And so getting people or giving people something else to do type of thing, as opposed to noticing, you know, the smoke and noticing discrimination and noticing racism and those kind of things. So hiding it under the guise of, oh, I'm hiring you and giving you this position, so therefore I'm not, being discriminatory towards you, whether, whatever the case might be. And so we can trace that, we can see that in our history, and also with Brown versus Board of Education and what that attempted to address, but also looking at the underlying things that exist when it comes to that. And so we've seen also this propaganda of school choice. And so all of these different mechanisms and ways to, fund or overfund schools and then underfund schools at the same time. And so it drives home the idea of apartheid, although that is something that people often use and associate with African territory, but that's not the case. It's like you said, Marina, it's global, it's everywhere, and we can see like this segregation and separation on the grounds of fill in the blank, and so it drives home and just reiterates that no, we are not living in this quote unquote post-racial society, and that there is no such thing as being colorblind. I don't know, I'm going into what you were going to say, but it's just it's really something to really look at, like these underlying factors that we might not necessarily see, straight off the cuff.
Absolutely. And I'm glad that you brought up Brown versus Board of Education, and we're talking about states' rights and all of it coming back and canceling history, because one part of history that we don't talk about, especially within like the idea of Brown versus Board of Education, was that there was Brown versus Board of Education 2. There was a court case that came after the original one. And I didn't learn this until I was in college in a sociology of law class. And I don't know why we didn't learn this earlier, because, I remember in like 8th grade watching the movie about Brown versus Board of Ed and like getting so much information about it and being told that this is a landmark case for like racial relations and how we're moving forward in this country. But basically Brown versus Board of Education said that, it's unconstitutional for schools to be racially segregated. And once that decision went out, schools and counties were like, okay, how do we do that? What does that even mean? How do we go about integrating schools? And so the second Brown versus Board of Education came in, where the Supreme Court now had to tell the states how this happened. And what ended up happening in this decision was that they told everyone that it was up to the counties and the school districts to decide how they want to integrate schools. And there's a very famous quote that one of the justices said, that they have to integrate, quote unquote, with all deliberate speed. And so that sounds very vague. Like, what does that mean? That means they have to do it quickly, right? Like, he said the word speed, that must mean fast. But what it actually meant is that, the school board got to decide how they integrate schools. And so if you give the decision back to racist school boards, back to racist counties, they're not going to begin integrating their schools. And so while we like say that this decision is huge and it's a landmark case, there's actually much more to the history of it that we don't know. And in fact, schools were not integrated until years later, where Congress basically said, if you don't integrate your schools, we're not giving you funding. So it wasn't until money was involved that schools started to get integrated in the South. So there is so much history that is, well, it's not canceled, it's just like hidden, like we don't learn about it. And it just goes into the discussion of there's more going on, that we just talk about states' rights, how, racist people will continue doing what they want to do if we don't make sure that like these decisions are actually being put in place and they're being like made sure that they happen, because integration, it took a very, very long time, and I think that's a piece of history we don't think about very much.
Right.
Yeah, so I think both of you hit on everything that I was going to say, really. So just to add, I mean, the only thing that I would add there is going back to the colorblind language, because I think that that's something important today, especially with governors and politicians trying to kind of get rid of categories and like trying to make people like forget about identifying yourself as something. I think we discussed this in a previous episode maybe, but we did have I think it was Bill Posey. He's a congressman here in Florida, or state representative, and he had tried to get this bill passed. I have no idea if it passed or not, but he was trying to, his plan was really to get any sort of state document to not have like a box for race, a box for gender, sexual, like he wanted to get rid of all categories. And so that might sound good to some people, especially when we do know that people think we're living in a post-racial society, as you said, Kristal. So I think that that can sound very attractive to people, and it's actually really, really dangerous because it obscures what really is going on and the dynamics that are going on. And even as we've seen, even though we do have Brown versus Board of Education, we've seen how organizations and schools and school districts have found ways to still go around that and continue perpetuating segregation and basically the further like disempowerment and oppression of Black people and other people of color. So basically it's really important to understand what's going on and the importance of color blindness and how dangerous it actually is, even if it sounds good, like, oh, I don't see color, like we're all one race. It's not that easy. We wish it was. So yeah, so I think we can move on to the next section of the conversation if you lead us there, Halley.
Yeah, so I just want to talk about how we want to transform our outrage in a powerful way, and how we talked about communities of resistance. How are these created? And that's kind of the conversation I want to move into now.
Yeah, so here we really want to draw from Black feminist knowledge, because that's pretty much where we get our inspiration from. And so I had a question for Kristal about, so we know that these movements have come, there's people that have come before us that have done this work before and have faced circumstances that we haven't faced in this specific time in history, and they still achieved social change. So we talk about care, self-care, and community, caring for community. So what does caring for community mean as proposed by Black feminists and others?
Yeah, thank you. So I think a big part of it is, the work that people do. Like some people that I think about are, Ida B. Wells and Angela Davis and Patricia Hill Collins, and there's so many voices, excuse me, so many scholars, and also Bell Hooks is a great excuse me, person to point out and bring up. And so with all of them and so many other people that I did not name, big parts of their work have been advocacy, advocating for one another, advocating for rights, and using the pen and the different mechanisms that they have to advocate for justice and advocate for one another, and speaking back to power and equipping ourselves with knowledge to be able to articulate those things and reach audiences. And sometimes those audiences are among us, within the academy, and trying to trying to speak back to power and involve some type of change in a way, and moving the needle in the right direction. And sometimes that's in that way. Sometimes it's going beyond that and going into our communities, going into our neighborhoods, or working with organizations. So it can look so many different ways. But I think the bottom line is love and advocacy. That's racial advocacy and social advocacy, because there's a lot of what I've experienced and learned and seen is that there are a lot of movements and organizations that can hide behind this cloud or this intention, but it's really not it's not forthcoming, it's not forthright, it's not what we think it is, to what they appear to be. It's something else, if that makes sense. So sometimes people can, or organizations can, say one thing, but really when it comes down to it, it's about financial or economic gain or notoriety or what have you. And so really, and that's something that Charles Mills talks a lot about too, is this idea of social advocacy and what that means. So getting down to the bottom of what that means and what that means to certain people, and understanding that we live in a racial society, a racial hierarchy that segments people and qualifies and unqualifies or disqualifies people on the grounds of who they are and what they look like and how they talk and things of that sort. And so it's this hierarchy that has been, quote unquote, given to us, that exists among us, in here, out there. And so it's, if we take the power that we have in our advocacy and in our voices and raising that up to strengthen other people, and having that, like you said, that collective community, that collective care, and the ability to care for oneself and the ability to care for others. And so by doing this, we show our love and we show our advocacy, and then we can educate others. And so anything that goes against that is I think a lot of that is what we're seeing today. And not just today, I mean, it's been coming through for a long time. These things that we are experiencing and seeing, they are not new. Different tactics are attempted, and different mechanisms and ways of doing things, but it's still under the same type of line of argument that predecessors before us went through.
Right.
It's just like taking a picture and putting it in a different frame.
Yes, absolutely. And I really want to amplify what you said about how there's a lot of movements and organizations that seem like you think they say something, they claim something, they claim to want to do something for social change, and then you look behind it and really what's going on is another thing. And I really relate that to my own understanding. Being a person that's always on social media, I'm very familiar with the conversations that are happening, and sort of seeing organizations, corporations doing these things. And we talk about greenwashing and all these things during Pride Month. And so we see that, and I think, I don't mean to paint up everybody in our society with the same brush, but I think that, so there's the main the dominant like people in social media, like white quote unquote allies and those organizations and corporations, what we're being sold basically is this neoliberal, like, and we talked about this in previous episodes, basically a very capitalistic, individualistic way of trying to respond to these social issues, but really really ends up reinforcing the system that exists. And it just ignores it because it ignores it and it obscures it. It ends up reinforcing it. And so I think personally, as I've been observing what's going on, I think there are definitely people that are waking up to this reality and trying to challenge corporations and challenge these ideas and these movements that are coming out of basically capitalism. So there's that, but there's also I think we still have a long way to go in terms of practicing what you just described, that collective community, like we talk about mutual aid and different types of just being involved in your community directly, rather than just being estranged, online. And I think social media, again, it's one of those things that it's like, it's good in some ways, it's helpful in some ways to educate and have it and connect us internationally, but it also estranges us from our own local communities. So it's just that kind of like tough position that I see our generation is in right now, and our society as a whole. We're kind of like trying to learn how to respond to these things, but we're still within this structure, so we still fall back into these previous like reactions and habits and things that we've been conditioned to. Because again, what you're describing, what you were saying, none of this is new. So it's interesting how we are finding new ways to respond to these things, but in some ways we're falling back into the same patterns that previous movements fell in the past.
Right.
So,
and that's a very good point too, because it's like, to me, it's like ebbs and flows, and just like, literally being on the water. And so you're going to have the ups and the downs, and then you'll have smooth, and then you'll have these ripples. And so, just like when, and I say this all the time as like an analogy of when you drop a coin or a stone into the water, this ripple effect out, and no one can control how far those ripples go or how it affects anyone else. Like there's no way to control that. It's dropped, and we can relate that to laws and bills and things that are passed and how it affects people. And so its original intent might be one thing, but it can end up affecting people in different ways years and years and years later. Well, that wasn't the intent. Well, that's the thing about manifest and latent function. Like, it wasn't intended that way, or maybe it was intended that way. And so like those underlying factors that we don't see right away, like Halley talked about, where you have to uncover and unpack, what those things are, what those mechanisms are, because there's always some type of force or mechanism behind everything that we see. And so in society or in our daily worlds, our experiences, there are these ups and these downs, these peaks and climax and things of that sort. And so, and just like the analogy or the thing I mentioned earlier, where people were removed from like their podium of, righteousness and talking about, things that were happening to them and to their communities. And so they were then given these positions and titles and salaries and benefits and all these things to distract them, and also give them a way to see, like, see, you can have this too, and you can, you can be involved in this endeavor as well. And so it's to pull away and retract from those intentions that social members and social groups have had. And so it like you said, it drives home this division that we see, and without community, it's unhealthy. Like it leads to alienation, and it can be very taxing, as opposed to, coming together.
Right. And I think the idea that's very taxing is important, because basically those who are marginalized, their existence is basically a form of resistance. Like, they use their bodies, their brains, they put their entire selves out there to be able to fight against what they're dealing with, and if they decide they want to. And so the people in power, they hope that we get burned out. They hope that we can no longer fight. We hope that we deteriorate our minds and our bodies and we can't keep going, because then they have nothing to fight back against. And so we have to remember that communities are important, because we have to keep pushing our movements forward. And it can be extremely frustrating that all of this has happened before, or it can be very comforting that all of this has happened before. There are two different ways to look at it, to know that if there is if people are being more marginalized, if there are oppressive laws being put out, this isn't the first time it's happened. We've been able to work past them. Communities have been built in the past. So it's not like we are doing this alone. It's not like we can't do anything about it. So that's kind of comforting, but it's also frustrating that we have to keep fighting it. So that's where the communities come in. When you're dealing with all this frustration, you have to make sure you look out for yourself and you look out for your community, because you will not be able to move forward when you're burnt out. And essentially, those in power, the elites, the corporations, political elites, they want us to get burned out, so we can't keep fighting against it. So I think that's why collective care is so important.
Yes, and I think we'll talk about this more in the latter half of the episode, but they have these strategies. These groups that are in power right now, corporations, like whatever, political organizations, they know this, and they are actually really good at thinking long term and taking tiny little steps towards the end goal. And I think that sometimes we want like a quick solution, and we see something happen and we're like, oh, we have to go out and fight now. And it's like, you're gonna burn yourself out. Like, I saw this online. Somebody made a point about how sometimes we put all of our effort into this one single protest, or like a single continuous protest for like a week, and then we burn ourselves out completely, instead of actually taking the time, like, okay, we know this is happening. We know there's a long-term plan that they have. There's an agenda. So we could learn something maybe from their ability to like take this end goal and like work towards it and build coalitions and build community throughout the process. And so I think I did want to bring up a quote by Audre Lorde, because we really like this quote, and it goes back to what you said, Halley, about our existence being resistance. And so Audre Lorde, basically she was talking about self-care, and she discusses that, this is a quote, "Caring for myself is not self-indulgence, it is self-preservation. And that is an act of political warfare." And I think that's exactly what you're describing. Understanding that the system, the structures, the people that are oppressing us, they don't want us to take care of ourselves. They don't want us to come together. They don't want us to, because it is destructive to their system. And so that's why she describes it as an act of political warfare. So the last thing I kind of wanted to bring up about that as well, just not just about caring for ourselves and as our communities, but also within that framework, Patricia Hill Collins talks about ethic of care and ethic of personal accountability. And I think those are not things that our societies really, our mainstream society is like used to pretty much. Because she talks about basically empathy and understanding emotions just as logical as anything. Like not creating that binary between emotions and logic. And also personal ethics of personal accountability, holding people responsible for the things that they say and the things that they claim to know. So I think that is missing, or at least, it's there, because again, we will always have groups that are practicing this, especially, again, Black people, Black activists, immigrants, immigrant groups, activist groups, different marginalized groups that are actively practicing these things, because it's been something that has been needed for our survival pretty much. People are practicing this, but what I mean is this is not accepted in our dominant society. It's seen, and that's where claims of cancel culture come in. So I just kind of wanted to have a brief discussion about how we, in these social justice movements, understanding self-care and collective care through the lens of Black feminist activists, we understand that personal accountability is also part of that. And it's not a bad thing. It's actually something that's meant to build you. But we know that there's these claims about cancel culture. So we just wanted to have that conversation now. So not sure.
I just wanted to pop in and like the idea, speaking of the ethic of care and stuff like that, the idea that emotions are not separate from intellect, I think is fascinating, because it's the opposite of the facts don't care about your feelings that like Ben Shapiro has like made super popular in mainstream culture today, that like what you're feeling and what you're going through does not matter because facts exist, as if facts are completely separate from what people are feeling individually. And like this whole like ethic of care, like the emphasis on individual uniqueness, it seems completely like antithetical to what like movements, like alt-right movements, are like, oh, everyone needs to be white, everyone needs to be the same, there's this like ethno state, everyone has to remain in this perfect box. Like this, like the idea of empathy, that we have to care for each other, and that accountability is a form of love and a form of care. And it's just so different from what I see from other movements. So I think it's really important to emphasize that. And like we can move forward with this idea of activism that is opposite to what the other side thinks or what other people think. And to just know that this option is out there, I think is really helpful, that there's a way to do it lovingly and by caring for other people and what they're going through and their emotions, and that people are unique and their experiences are important. And I think that is really great to think about moving forward as we talk about like individual experiences and their beliefs, and going into cancel culture. I just think it's important that we have this belief that is against this idea of like facts don't care about your feelings. We all need to be the same type movement going on.
Right. And I think speaking to what you just mentioned, the emotions aspect, and so there's a lot of misconceptions about social justice, especially, like I said, in our mainstream, like dominant society that is meant to uphold the racial hierarchy that we discussed. In that society, in that part of society, these things are not seen as love. These things are not seen as like validating. And it's interesting because to me, like, yeah, your emotions, even as let's say as a white person, because I do want to talk about what I call like the white allies or white liberals. Sometimes there have been times where some of these people, they will say like, oh, I'm opting out of social justice, I'm opting out of cancel culture, I'm opting out of call out culture. Anyways, because they were hurt, or they were, they felt some sort of way. They had a reaction, an emotional reaction to something that was said to them.
Right, they're being held accountable, basically.
Yes, and so there's also the nuance in that. So we're not saying that your emotions are not valid. Like, it's just that, where is that emotion coming from? Why are you responding that way? Yeah, sure, you feel hurt. Why do you feel hurt? What is within you that is causing this reaction? So it's not about like shutting that down. It's about exploring that and actually understanding, like, you as a white person and all of us in this society, but specifically speaking to those white allies, as I say, you are conditioned in certain ways. So when you join these social justice movements, there's a lot of behaviors that you will show that it's an unintentional and it is unconscious, but you need to be able to listen and actually question, like, wait, why am I feeling this way when this person told me this? Is this person trying to truly tear me down as I think, or are they showing me something that I wasn't aware of? And yeah, so I think that talking about cancel culture and people that are maybe pushed away from social justice movements because of what they call cancel culture, I think that understanding that, you know, when you enter these spaces, especially spaces that are meant to bring safety for people of color and people that have been marginalized in different ways, if you as a person that has privilege comes into this space, you need to understand that you have some entitlement that it will come with you. You might expect not to be spoken back to or like challenged in any way. You might expect to be like accepted unconditionally. Anything you say will be accepted and no one will respond. And that's not how that works. So we're just speaking to the fact that I think we just want to bring light to the fact, maybe if that's what you've heard as a listener about social justice movements, like we're trying to discuss where that comes from and sort of what really is going on. It's not, you're not being shut down, you're not being canceled. It's actually, we're trying to love you by showing you something that you don't see. And I think James Baldwin said something like that too. Like, if I love you, I need to make you aware of what you can't see. And so that's what I wanted to say there.
And I think that's very powerful, too, Marina. I mean, excuse me, because when the focus is on the individual themselves, then that is where I think, anyway, that the confusion will come, and, you know, feelings being spurned or hurt or whatnot, as opposed to the focus being on what it is that movement is all about, or what it is that, you know, the social inequality that is being addressed. And so when we get ourselves out of the way and not focus on ourselves and our feelings and comfortability and things of that sort.
Yeah, absolutely. It's kind of, you have to kind of take the ego out of yourself. You have to say, I made a mistake. I do feel embarrassed about it, and that's okay. It's embarrassed to feel like that immediate reaction of like, oh God, what did I just do? Like, I need to protect myself. Like, of course, that's your immediate reaction. We're humans. That's how we're going to react. But taking the ego out of it, realizing it's bigger. This movement's bigger than just an individual person. It's bigger than just you. There should be like a balance, you know. We don't want to lose the strength of our coalitions by like making people fearful to speak, by making people fearful to join. You know, there's this idea that leftist coalitions like gatekeep and like we care about like every single word that comes out of your mouth. But, you know, you don't have to be perfect to be a part of a coalition, as long as you understand that you need to be held accountable. And we need to also believe that people can change and that we can work together. If we don't believe that people can change, then what's the point of all of this fighting that we're doing to move forward and create change? I do believe if someone makes a mistake and it isn't harmful or have malicious intent, people can learn from it. And so it's like, also there's balance, you know, if you're being harmful to a group, you should not be in that group anymore, obviously. So there is a very hard balance that has to come when you're building these coalitions to, one, understand as a group that people can change and people will make a mistake, and also towards yourself that you will make a mistake and you need to be held accountable for that, and that doesn't make you necessarily a bad person that needs to be like canceled, and you don't have to fight against these organizations that are holding you accountable. That's just kind of how this works.
We'd also like to thank the University of Central Florida Department of Sociology for their generous support of this podcast.